in the entire book of Esther, interestingly, God's name is not mentioned a single time, right? Not even once. But as we'll see, it doesn't mean that God isn't present, but how God is present, the way in which God is working, becomes a little bit more nuanced. Now, on paper, okay, this idea of crisis is quite an interesting thing, right? Because the idea of crisis, decisive historical moments, oftentimes actually seems very appealing to us, right? We imagine ourselves in similar situations, important times, exciting times. We think about, how would I react? What would I have done in this situation? Right, one reason why I say the Ukrainian crisis is so appealing to us now, maybe even addicting to watch the news, is because a lot of times I think it's easy to imagine ourselves in this situation, right? The Ukrainians are the good guys. The Russians are the bad guys. They're fighting against oppression. They're fighting for their freedom, right? We wonder, if I'm in that situation, what would I do? How many of you guys have heard of the name Dietrich Bonhoeffer? Bonhoeffer was a German pastor during World War II. Initially, towards the beginning of the war, he fled the country to be safe, but later on he returned to resist the Nazis and to support his church people and the movement that he was a part of. He was part of what's called the Confessing Church, who continued to speak out against and resist against the Nazis when much of the German church had already bowed their knees and said that what the Nazis are doing is right. Bonhoeffer was even involved in a plot to assassinate Hitler, and eventually Bonhoeffer was arrested and was executed by the Nazis. There's nothing wrong with Bonhoeffer. I consider him to be a very influential figure in my life as well. But there's a problem with him, right? Which is that too many Christians have turned Bonhoeffer into a symbol. They don't really care much about his personal life and the details of his life. They don't care as much what he said and thought. But in America especially, Bonhoeffer has become a symbol that the Republican right uses for conservative values, for Trumpism. We are the good guys like Bonhoeffer. Those who are our enemies are the bad guys like the Nazis. The world is black and white. We are on the good side. We must protect the truth because we are the main character of this story. Now, when we go back to our text, right, looking at the story of Esther, one thing I think that we have to be reminded of is that not everything is about us, right? We are not always the main characters, right? The cause that we are supporting are not hills to die on. The fate of the world is not always resting on our shoulders. But a lot of times people think that I'm the main character in the world, right? I think social media sometimes, especially if you're quite popular on social media, helps to kind of reinforce this idea that we are very important, that we are main characters. But the truth is, we are most likely not Esther. We are not Joan of Arc or people like that. 99.999% of us are not called to be people who change the world in a big way or to be martyrs for some greater cause. But instead, I think the book of Esther teaches us an important lesson. First, God is faithful. Secondly, that God's people must remain faithful to Him in all of the decisions and the crises in their lives, whether big or small. That when God's people trust that God is good and faithful and act in the world based on this truth, based on faith, that God can and will work through them to bring about His purposes. At times, acting in faith, trusting in God can be a very difficult thing. We don't know if things will work out. Sometimes this could actually be risking ourselves, dangerous for our own lives, right? Esther, we know, in her story, has to risk her own life, not knowing whether or not she will survive, not knowing whether her people will be saved or not. But the point of Esther, I think the bigger picture of the story is reminding us, is that God is faithful. He is working in this world for our good. His people believe in this truth and should trust Him because they believe it. That stories of the past, the Bible, right, even our own histories, it reminds us that God is working in this world for our good, for His purposes, not primarily through miracles and supernatural events and things like that, but that oftentimes God is calling very ordinary people to act in very ordinary ways to accomplish His purposes. That even though at times God doesn't seem to be present, that evil people seem to be running the show, that when we look back and see how things have unfolded, that God was really present, sometimes in the smallest details, sometimes in the littlest things that people are doing. That God's people, therefore, need to be faithful because God is working through them, that you and I as well might be part of God's plan in a bigger way, in ways that we might not imagine. We might not be the main character of the story, but that we as well can act in similar ways, in smaller ways.